So thankful to be here this morning. It's been a wonderful time already of worshiping God, and I appreciate both Dan and Stan for leading our songs, and Noah for the Lord's Supper reading as well, and others that have participated. If you want to open your Bibles to the book of Esther, that's where we're going to be this morning, and we're really going to be talking about selections of Esther from Esther chapters really 3 through 7, and we'll get there in just a moment. I have a spreadsheet, and on my spreadsheet I have, by the way, they say that you can lose an audience attention in 30 seconds. Talking about a spreadsheet is probably not a good introduction to a lesson, but I have a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet I've got my series titles and topics and all that, and I sent Cindy for the bulletin, I sent her next week's title. So it's actually not the sovereignty of God that we're talking about today, although in a way it is. We're really talking today about the pride of Haman and the toxicity of pride, really. And so next week you'll see the silent sovereignty, or the strange sovereignty of God. We're talking about Haman this morning, Esther chapters 3 through 7. Now, before we get started talking about Haman, I want to stress to you that there's something very dangerous that could happen to you during this sermon. No, not physically dangerous, but something dangerous that can happen to your heart during this message. Because we're going to be talking about someone who is probably the most clear picture, caricature almost, of pride in all of the Bible. I mean, this is a person that is so egocentric, so focused and fixated on himself, that Esther actually presents him in the text as someone with basically an absurd view of themselves. I mean, we shouldn't miss, while we're reading Esther, we shouldn't miss that the phrasing of certain things is intended to produce a chuckle in our minds at thinking, how laughable is this person's arrogance? We're going to talk about someone who has basically everything the world has to offer, and his only problem is there's one guy that doesn't like him, and he says, I'm going to kill that guy, and I'm going to kill every person of the Jewish race because that guy's a Jew. And we're thinking, what? How did you get that? You know, you have everything, and that one guy not standing up before you is enough for you to plan the destruction of an entire people? It's crazy. It's crazy. But it's not that crazy. And here's the dangerous thing. What can easily happen to me and to you when we're talking about Haman this morning is we can think, wow, what a terrible person. And not realize that on certain days, in certain moments, when we go on Monday morning and we look at ourselves in the mirror, we don't see hidden behind our own reflection a little picture of Haman in our face. That this very same pride that had so infected Haman also at many times infects us. In fact, the entire story of humanity is the infection of sin, which sin really at its very root is pride. The saying to God, I'll do it my way, I don't want your way. That pride has infected us from day one till today. And if I read the story of Esther and I come away thinking, boy, that Haman was a bad guy, even chuckling at Haman, what a ridiculous guy, and I don't look in the mirror, then this has been an exercise in futility. Actually, even worse than that. And we'll talk about the blindness of pride later, but it will just further entrench in you the idea that there are some people that really struggle with pride, rather than looking within and saying, boy, root out every last hint of Haman in me. So there's the danger and there's the warning, and we're looking at Esther, the 3rd chapter. What I'd like to do today, as we talk about Haman and the picture of pride, what I'd like to do today is essentially talk about the nature of pride. What is pride and what does it look like? And then talk about, okay, is there a cure for pride? And what we're going to find is the cure for pride actually surfaces itself in this story for Haman, but unfortunately he doesn't find it. The nature of pride, we'll start there. What is pride? I'm going to borrow a definition from C.S. Lewis. He says that pride is a ruthless, sleepless, smileless self-absorption. Now listen, I could have saved myself some work. That would have been a great sermon, okay? Ruthless, smileless, sleepless, and we could have had 3 points in a poem sermon. But anyway, that'd be a good sermon for another time. But he says that pride at the very core, and we all know this, is self-absorption. Self-fixation, self-obsession, however you want to describe it. But before we actually look at Haman, let me just caution you into another danger, another problem that can happen is when you hear self-absorption, you can think of the most conceited person that you know, or condescending or smug or whatever. You could think of that person and you can say, I'm not like that person. Pride really manifests itself in two ways. On the one hand, self-absorption leads to a longing for self-exaltation. I need to feel superior to those people. I am above average, which the Bulletin article kind of talked about, but a need to be elevated above others. Pride is always comparative. It's always comparative. I need to be superior on the one hand. On the other hand, self-absorption can lead not to self-exaltation, but to self-loathing, to self-contempt. Both a person who is always trying to exalt themselves and a person who is always tearing themselves down, they both have the same problem. Their eyes are fixed firmly on themselves. And probably in your life, you will go through seasons in which you have pride manifesting in one of both ways. I mean, it's unlikely that you'll just be, well, I've got the self-loathing kind of pride. No, it's always changing in your heart. But the thing is, you got to be aware that pride isn't just someone puffing themselves up arrogantly. It also has to do, in some sense, with a deep sense of self-criticism and insecurity. And what we see when we're talking about the person Haman, we see that manifesting itself in both ways in his life. He is at one time exalting himself as much as he possibly can, and yet he has this deep sense of insecurity going on in his heart. Okay, enough about that, but for the time being, let's just start by saying pride at its very core is self-absorption, and that can take many different, it can manifest itself many different ways, but it always comes back to self. Now let's talk about Haman. You look at Esther chapter 3, and we're just going to read the first few verses here, the first 3 verses. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him, and look at this, and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. That's a pretty good promotion. He said, I'm going to exalt you above all of the officials. Essentially, Haman is going to become Ahasuerus, Xerxes' right-hand man. He's going to be the second in control over Persia, in a sense. So he exalts him to nearly the highest place that he could be exalted to. And in verse 2, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Now you learn something so important about pride when you look at these 3 verses. Pride is desperate for approval. Haman, he's longing in his comparative way. He's longing to be number one above everybody. He's longing to have the superiority and all of that. But notice, pride is desperate for approval and will compel it if it can't earn it. Did you notice that twice the king's command is mentioned here? Haman is number 2 in all of the kingdom, and Mordecai doesn't bow down before him. And what do the king's servants say? They don't say, don't you know that's Haman, the second in command, and he's done this and he's done that, and why are you not bowing down? No. They say, why don't you follow the king's law? Haman's his need for others to respect him and his need to have himself up a notch has led him to the king giving an edict, probably with him whispering in his ear. You got to bow down before Mordecai. Anybody that doesn't bow down before... If you have to have a command for people to honor you, for people to respect you, then you're not respected. You're not honored. But pride is so desperate for that position that it'll compel honor if it can't earn it. There's the first thing. If you are having to issue commands for respect, then you already know that you've lost it. You don't have it. It's something that is earned. True leaders know that, right? That ultimately the threat of violence is a very poor motivator. It's a very poor motivator. Why? Because you'll always get just what you ask for if you have a threat of violence, never more. If you have a threat of violence and you say, you do this or I'll do this, and if you really mean it and you really have the whatever you need to follow through with your threat, that person will always give you just what you ask for, but never more. And yet, if you've earned someone's respect, if you've earned their love, and you say, hey, would you do this for me? They're going to do it. And if they see something else that needs to be done, or if they see, oh, you know what? If I do this, it's actually going to cause a problem. They're going to call you up and say, are we sure we want to do it this way? Because I just noticed. You say, oh, thank you so much. But if you have to rely on threats of violence, you'll always get just what you ask for anyway. That's a separate lesson. Pride, desperate for approval, and it'll compel it if it can't earn it. Here's something else we see about pride as we keep going. If you look at Esther 3, verse 5, you go down a little bit further. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. Go with, if you would, to Esther chapter 5, verses 19 and following. 9 and following, because we're going to read a fairly lengthy section here. Haman sees Mordecai, and he's filled with fury over the fact that he's not bowing down. And it happens again when Haman's going to see Mordecai, and he's going to be filled with fury. But I want you to hear what he does when he has this rage built up within him. In Esther 5, we're fast forward a little ways. Haman's already planned to try to eradicate Mordecai's family and everything. His people and everything. And Esther's been given in chapter 4 the great appeal. Please help us. And she's going to say, if I perish, I perish. You know, Esther 5. She invites Haman and the king to a banquet, and Haman is like on top of the world because the queen of Persia has invited him to a feast with just the king and her. And even better, at the end of the section there in chapter 5, she's going to invite him to a second feast with just the king and her. Here's verse 9. Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and he brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And here's what he does. Listen. Haman has been promoted to the second most powerful person in the world. He is second in command in Persia. He's got all the wealth, all the riches. He's got people that are bowing down to him at every turn. There's only one guy that won't bow to him. And he calls all his friends, all his family. He says, come over to my house. I need to talk to you. And here, look what he does. Verse 11. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her, together with the king. What's he doing? He's saying, I need you to know my resume. I've called you here today to tell you about how great I am. But what does he say in the very next verse? All of this is nothing to me, as long as I see Mordecai the Jew standing at the king's gate. Every bit of this, he says, is worthless to me as long as I see Mordecai not bowing down to me. Here's the next thing that we learn about pride. It's desperate for approval, but it's exceedingly fragile. Our sense of self becomes, when pride has infected us, and it's infected us all, we become very fragile people. Because Haman says, I can have 99.99999% of all I've ever wanted. There's just one person that is not seeing things the way I'm seeing them. And what does he say? He said, I'm going to destroy the world over it, basically. He said, I'm going to try to kill every last one of them because of it. Can you imagine a self that is so fragile that just one person that doesn't see things his way is enough to send out this spiral of chaos, this spiral of destruction? But here's what I'd like to warn you about, and that's the next thing. If you look at Esther 3, verse 6, Esther 3, verse 6, Mordecai, didn't bow down. Haman's filled with fury. Esther 3, verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout all the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. And then you go down just a little ways to verse 13. And in verse 13, the edict goes out that Haman has written up for the king. Letters were sent out by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. You could go back and see the same thing in chapter 5, verse 14, where they are going to, his wife's suggestion to him when he's having this crisis of identity is, why don't you make a gallows for Mordecai's death? Make it like 80 feet tall. And so he does. So that's great. Let's do that, right? Then my life will be complete as long as this guy is out of the picture. It's exceedingly fragile, but is also shockingly destructive. And here's the warning for you. The reason that your pride in your life, apart from Christ, the reason that your pride does not lead you to the same extreme as Haman's is not because you and me are vastly superior people to Haman. The reason is because we don't have the same opportunity that Haman had. You ever notice that Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, if you're angry with your brother, it's like you've killed him in your heart. Jesus is saying the difference between you and a murderer is not that you are somehow vastly more righteous. It's that the circumstances never lended themselves to you acting on that anger. If there wasn't societal consequences or social consequences or people were going to find out or whatever, he says, no, actually, you don't realize, but that anger that seems so insignificant, left to its own devices, it's going to lead you to kill your brother. Cain and Abel, second sin in all of Scripture. A little anger gets in, little envy, little contempt, and all of a sudden, death. Haman here, he sees one person and he says, I'm going to go on a massive destruction route. If you were in Haman's position, apart from Christ, right? If you're in Haman's position, do you think that you or me would choose anything less than what he chose? That's where we can't lose the mirror, right? And say, oh, Haman, he's so bad. No. The same thing infecting him is infecting us. Pride is shockingly destructive, and it's totally blind to itself. The greatest story to me in the whole book of Esther is what happens when Haman, in verses really 5, 9, which we've already read, all the way through part of chapter 6. To just narrate it to you, because it would be a pretty good length to read, but I'm going to read you a little bit of it. But what happens is Haman has made the plans to destroy Mordecai. He's built the gallows and everything, right? So he wakes up and he starts walking towards the palace of the king, and he's got this smile on his face. He says, "Oh, we're ready for the plans to go into effect. I've got the situation, I've got the setting designed perfectly for Mordecai's death, for it to be pleasing to me and all this stuff." He's like, "Okay, we're going to get rid of Mordecai. Everything's going to be good." But verse 1 of chapter 6, on that night, the king could not sleep. While Mordecai is having all these plans, he's making all these plans, the king can't sleep, and the king wakes up and he wants to read. And so he's brought this book called The Chronicles of the Kings of Persia, or something like that, and he's reading it. And as he's reading it, he reads about a person who saved his life, who heard about a conspiracy to kill the king and reported it, and the king's life was saved because of it. And it just so happens his name was Mordecai. When Mordecai was out at the gate to visit Esther, he overheard something, he reported it, saved the king's life. And the king's sitting there at 4 a.m., and he's thinking, what has been done to honor this man? So he's thinking about it. So a little while later in the morning, his servants are there, and he says, what's been done to honor this man? And they say, well, nothing's been done. And he says, and here's where the plot just gets so great. He says, who's in the court right now? And who's in the court but Haman walking in saying, today's the day Mordecai's going away. And Haman's in the court, and they say, Haman, second in command, he's in the court. And so the king says, oh, well, bring Haman in then. And he said, I wonder what Haman thinks we should do for this guy. So he asks Haman, and this is exactly what he asks him. He says, what should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And do you know what Mordecai says to himself? Who would the king delight to honor more than me? Pride is totally blind to itself. In Haman's perspective, everything he's seeing with clarity. He's just right, He's not proud, he's right. So Haman walks in and he says, who on earth could possibly want to honor more than me? So he says, here's what you should do, king. Get one of the royal stallions, these horses. Bring them out. Get one of the robes, the purple robes that you've worn, and let the person wear the royal robe. Let them, be led throughout all the town with somebody going before them saying, behold, this is what happens to the one whom the king delights to honor. Oh, and Haman, probably nearly falls to the ground in shock when the king says, go, don't leave anything out of what you've said, do it all to the man Mordecai. The very man that Haman was there to talk about ending his life. And now Haman's going through and he's shouting, here's what happens to the man whom the king delights to honor. Pride, totally blind to itself. And finally, pride is ultimately deadly to its host. The powerful story in the book of Esther is not only does Mordecai's position get reversed, he goes from being at the gate to now he's riding the horse to eventually he's going to be second in command. But Haman goes from being on top of the universe, but because of this one man and his hatred of this one man and the pride that is killing him from the inside out, he builds this gallows 50 cubits high, and his fate is ultimately to suffer the fate that he had prepared for Mordecai. Because Esther eventually is going to say, a foe and an enemy, this man Haman, he's planning to kill us all. Pride ultimately is deadly to its host. Now let's talk just for a minute about the cure for pride. The cure for pride. I think ironically, the cure for pride is in some way apparent to us in the very same story we just talked about in Esther chapter 6. Because Haman could have responded two very different ways to the king's command to honor Mordecai. On the one hand, he could have acted like he did, which is begrudgingly to do it and to conspire and plan on how to bring him down. But he could have realized, this man saved the king's life. This man's worthy of honor. I should serve this man. I should put this man above myself, at least for a moment, at least for a day, and say, here's the man whom the king delights to honor. He couldn't, but he should have. And as you really stop and think about it, and you look here at what happens in Haman's life, and you think about how could he have been cured? How are you cured of pride? Ultimately, you're cured of pride by learning to exalt the man the king delights to honor. That man in this case was Mordecai, but Jesus is the better Mordecai. Jesus, the one who is the rightful king, and the one the Father delights to honor. The way that you cure pride is in your heart to put Jesus on the strongest horse you've ever imagined in your heart. The purple robe, the crown, the splendor, the scepter, whatever. And to live your life walking with Jesus and saying, look at the King. Look at the glory and the honor that is deserving of this King. You know what? That's the cure for pride of both forms. Of self-absorption in the form of self-exaltation and in the form of self-contempt and self-loathing. Why? Because you've got your eyes finally off yourself. Look at the man. Look at the King that God delights to honor and glory. Now, the wonderful truth of the gospel is that while Jesus deserves every bit of that exaltation, he got down off the horse. He lost the robes that belonged to him and was given robes of mockery. The crown that should have been on his head was replaced with a crown of thorns. And instead of every human being on earth saying, look at the man God delights to honor, the crowd, we spat on his face. We humiliated him, hurt him, ultimately killed him. Why? Because when you come to Christ and you finally turn away from self and you look at him and you start exalting him as the Savior who suffered and died, all of a sudden you find that in a way that we can't even wrap our minds around, and we say, we're not worthy of this. You find Jesus there looking at you saying, here's the man the King delights to honor. And you say, Lord, you shouldn't honor me. You can't honor me. And he says, but I will. Because I got off the horse. I took off the robes. I took off the crown in order that you might be robed, you might be crowned, and you might be led in victory. What is the cure for pride? The cure for pride is ultimately to get your eyes on Jesus and not on yourself. The problem is that pride is blind, and we often don't realize just how fixated on ourselves we really are. If you're here today and pride is controlling you and consuming you, and you are a Christian and you want prayers, or if you're not a Christian and you want to come to fix your eyes firmly on Jesus all your life, and you want to get baptized and you want to walk with him every single day, whatever the case might be, we're going to invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.